welcome back to another episode of the Ruling on the Field podcast. I'm your host, Seth Mendelson, alongside my co-host, Sam Mendelson, and we have a lot to talk about. Week 13 is in the books. The NFL, the playoff pictures are getting exciting. A lot of teams are fighting. A lot of big movements happen in this playoff race. But let's start, Sam. Monday night game. You had Cincinnati and the Jacksonville Jaguars, a Cincinnati team that some people may have written off once Joey B was done for the season, but we saw the Bengals get this huge victory in this game in overtime and keep their season alive. Let's start here because there was also a pretty big injuries, a couple of injuries in Jacksonville. I want to get your thoughts. Let's jump in.
Well, it seems like Joe Burrow, initial JB, transferred his powers into the other JB that was starting at quarterback in Jake Browning, because Jake Browning, Seth, he was balling. I mean, Jamar Chase had an unbelievable day. He hit him on a beautiful seam route down the sidelines. It was just incredible. And the whole game, it seemed like the Bengals dictated the game over the Jaguars. I mean, their defense bent but not breaks, and it didn't make a lot of plays. The Jaguars, you're talking about one of those injuries. They lost Christian Kirk on the opening drive to what's been reported now as a core injury, which is going to require surgery. So he's going to be out at least multiple weeks. And that is probably their best receiver, even though we all came into the season thinking it could be Calvin Ridley. But the big injury, though, was not on Cincinnati's side. It was on Jacksonville's side. Trevor Lawrence goes down with a high ankle sprain. And if you're watching the game like you and I were, Seth, you saw and you heard the audible gasp from the entire Jacksonville fan base. Some players go down and you're like, dang, we need Evan Ingram or we need this guy. You can't lose your quarterback. And, we came into this year, at least I did, thinking the Jaguars were going to just coast through the AFC South. And it hasn't been the case. They lost a game to Houston at home. They barely beat Houston the second time. They've had their difficulties with Indianapolis, although they did sweep both those games. They got blown out by San Fran. They've had ups and downs. They beat Buffalo in London. They beat Atlanta in London. They had two games in London. They won back-to-back. And so I don't really know what to make of this team. But now you're throwing in C.J. Beathard with potential Canadian CFL superstar Nathan Rourke as the backup, because it looks like Trevor Lawrence is going to be out week to week at least. And they've got Joe Flacco on the Browns, which, Joe Flacco played well against the Rams, and we know what the Browns defense could do. And then you've got a Sunday nighter against the Ravens, which for all intents and purposes has huge implications. Even if they get into the playoffs and they get a home playoff game, Baltimore and Jacksonville are finalizing or trying to get up there with Miami and Kansas City for that top seed berth. But going back to the game, I came into this game, I took Jacksonville's D in fantasy this week. I thought the Bengals were going to struggle. I thought the Jacksonville Jaguars had to have this game. Next thing I know, the game's in overtime. Trevor Lawrence is out in the locker room, and Money McPherson hits a big field goal in overtime. A game in which Jake Browning, again, was able to march down the field. Joe Mixon had his best performance of the year. T. Higgins came back into the lineup. He didn't have a big game, but you could see the impact that he does have. He takes a little bit more pressure off Jamar Chase. He caught a couple big first down plays. And all of a sudden, the Bengals, who I wrote out a week ago or 2 weeks ago when I saw Joe Burrow, tear his ligament against the Ravens and say that's done. Now they're still in the hunt, and they're right into the mix, and they're going up against your Indianapolis Colts this week, Seth.
Yeah, they're right into the mixing, you could say, because of the way he played last night with his 2 touchdowns. And look, if you roll the tape back 2 episodes ago when this Joey B injury happened, I told you can't write off this Bengals team because there's so much talent. And that's what we saw. Like, obviously, not taking away anything of what Jake Browning did. That was a performance for the ages, I'd honestly say. 32, 37, like just ridiculous numbers. But there's just so much talent on this team, and the Bengals in this, what's turning into a wild AFC wildcard race, really, you can't rule them out. And they are definitely going to be a team next week. They're playing against Indianapolis at home. So you're riding off this big victory. If they win that game, they probably surpass Indianapolis, and they're being right into a playoff spot. So the Cincinnati Bengals are very much still in this hunt. And it will be very interesting to see how this unfolds because, like you mentioned, Cleveland has Joe Flacco as their quarterback. Now we see Pittsburgh, Kenny Pickett's hurt for a few weeks. Jacksonville, Trevor Lawrence is hurt for a few weeks. So when you are in this, you never want to lose a quarterback. That's obviously, case in point. Like, this is your guy that leads your team. He's your general. He's really like the most important player position in any sport.
Yeah, no question.
No question. But when you're in this playoff deadlock, to not have your starting quarterback, it really opens the doors for teams who, like the Bills, like the Texans, like the Broncos, who are right behind them, trying to push for their or punch their ticket in.
Well, and unless you're the college football committee and you don't consider what a backup quarterback means, or you should take that into account. And I know it's too soon to the Florida State fans out there, but the fact of the matter is that, and backup quarterbacks have done well in the NFL, and we've actually also seen backup quarterbacks do well in the college football playoffs. And again, we're not talking about college football, but Florida State, undefeated, probably should have got in all over Alabama. Just one little note on the college football rankings. But yeah, this is crazy. And what a crazy week it was for the AFC South, because the Houston Texans were dominating against Denver. They end up winning, but they lose Tank Dell, their rookie wideout, who's been fantastic. Now you look at that offense and you got Noah Brown, Nico Collins, and then Dalton Schultz, who's been up and down with injuries. Damian Pierce, Devin Singletary, there's not really much. CJ Stroud looks like he's going to win the shoe-in for the Rookie of the Year, but they lose a big injury. Jacksonville loses a big injury. Indy, in one of the weirdest games, and I know you and I were watching it together, but 2 blocked punts. I mean, Derrick Henry gets knocked out with a concussion. He's out. I mean, the Titans are out of the playoffs, but, look at that AFC playoff picture right now, and look at the teams in the wild card. You've got Kenny Pickett, as you mentioned, they're in a playoff spot right now, but it's now Mitch Trubisky. Cleveland threw out Joe Flacco, and they're probably going to throw out Joe Flacco again because Deshaun Watson's out for the year. They are now on their 4th quarterback this season with DTR and PJ Walker, Deshaun Watson, and now Joe Flacco. And then obviously with the Colts, and we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast, Anthony Richardson to Gardner Minshew. Couple of those teams are going to get in, maybe 1, maybe 2, and we'll talk about the AFC South and who will get in just a moment. But Jake Browning, we got Billy Zappi playing Mitch Trubisky on Thursday. There are so many backup quarterbacks. I personally can't remember, Seth, a year with so many quarterback injuries. The Jets don't even know what to do. They just released Tim Boyle today, and he was the guy, and Zach Wilson may or may not want to start ever again for the Jets. But what do you make of the AFC South? I mean, 2 big injuries. Tank Dell, fractured fibula. He's done for the year. And Trevor Lawrence, high ankle sprain, week to week. That could have an impact. It's not like Jacksonville, has a couple games where they can, fall and other teams will come up. Houston and Indy are right on their coattails.
Yeah, I have no idea who wrote the script this year. Like, it has been hard to follow. If you would have told me before the season that Joe Flacco would be trying to lead the Cleveland Browns team to a playoff spot and Josh Allen might not be in a playoff game, like, that to me is bonkers.
Well, you saw the video that they released the NFL before the season with Keegan-Michael Key, and they had a bunch of different NFL cameos.
Yeah.
They're like, what's the script? And then they're talking about it. No one saw the script coming. No one saw it. And it's just been insane to think of the quarterbacks who are put in positions to having to lead their teams. And Joe Flacco was on his couch 2 weeks ago, and he's now, like you just mentioned, trying to lead Cleveland into a playoff spot.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's mayhem, it's mania, it's Minshew mania. If you're a Colts fan watching Indianapolis, look, this team has been exciting to watch all year. Obviously, I mentioned this last week when Anthony Richardson went out. It definitely took a lot of the hype away from this team. But they, week in, week out, have been putting up very strong offensive numbers. Their defense is pretty sound for the most part, and getting a huge win in Tennessee. Those divisional games are always challenging. Will Levis really wanted to make a statement of why he thought he should have got drafted by Indianapolis. But Gardner Minshew is really looking like, you were just naming this laundry list of backup quarterbacks, and I would take Gardner Minshew over every one of them. And he's cemented himself into this role seamlessly.
And someone who had a big game on Sunday, Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel and the 49ers in a revenge game of the NFC Championship game, in which, Deebo Samuel came out during Super Bowl Media Week, obviously very disappointed and upset not to be a part of it, saying, imagine if Brock Purdy played 4 quarters in that game. And people forget, Brock Purdy got hurt, then they went with Josh Johnson. Josh Johnson was there for, I think, a week before. He was just their backup. He got hurt. They were running Christian McCaffrey as their quarterback. I mean, they were running, obviously, a lot of wildcard plays and a lot of RPOs, but it's not like he was really throwing the ball deep. Brock Purdy and the 49ers had less than a first down in total yards after the first quarter, and then they dominated the Eagles the rest of the way. Deebo Samuel had a total of 138 yards and 3 tutties. Him and DK Metcalf, 3 tutties, you're $10, you're a millionaire. But the 49ers imposed their will on the Eagles team. And more importantly, the Eagles, they have had many cracks in their armors that haven't been exposed because they haven't really faced it. We saw a couple times this year against Washington, who, for all intents and purposes, didn't know what the heck they were doing. Tyreek Hill said after the game that, they just didn't respect me, or, they didn't know what they were doing. And Tyreek Hill caught a bomb from Tua where he was running one way and then just turned around the last second and had enough time to turn around and make the play and catch it for a touchdown. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Eagles have gone away with a lot of wins. I mean, that there was a game where you had money on them and the Eagles were your survivor pick. And we went to a bar after the Cleveland Browns game, and it was a Jake Elliott, I think, 50-plus yard field goal in overtime with a couple minutes left. It could have been their last drive, and Washington could have actually ran a 2-point conversion. They scored with no time left to send the game to overtime. They didn't. They kicked the extra point. Point being is that there were a lot of moments where they didn't look good, and they looked very bad against the Jets without Aaron Rodgers, with Zach Wilson running, and their defense, and Jalen Hurts, he played very poorly. Jalen Hurts got hurt in this game. And then DeAndre Swift got rocked in a game where they're already down 25, 26 points. And you're wondering, is he going to be okay for Sunday? Now they have to go to Dallas, and we'll talk about that game in just a moment. But that is a massive game. But what were your takeaways from a game in which, we all kind of maybe thought like a 28-24, 38-28 type of battle, and it was just San Fran all the way?
Yeah, I just think it's, the tale of how a week can change the storyline of a team in this NFL that we're currently watching is so fascinating to me, because you saw them beat Kansas City and Buffalo, and you're like, the Eagles are the top dog in the NFL. And that's all people were saying. And, they beat Dallas as well, 3 heavy hitting teams. And obviously these were very close games, but good teams find a way to win, right? That's what the narrative was against or of the Philadelphia Eagles. And then they have this at-home NFC Championship rematch game. We're expecting it to be this highly contested game, and San Francisco's like, "Oh, you guys thought you were the top dogs? No, let me show you what we've got here. Let me show you, we got Brandon Ayuk playing great football. We got Brock Purdy playing lights out. We got George Kittle. We got best running back in the game, Christian McCaffrey. Oh, and let me throw in Deebo Samuel, right?" And I just think San Francisco really executed that game flawlessly, except for maybe the one moment in that game that no one saw coming, maybe the player of the game, Big Dom. You got to give love to Big Dom. One of my favorite storylines in the entire year of the NFL is Big Dom Disandro getting ejected and walking out of that Philadelphia stadium getting cheers from everyone. Sorry, I had to digress and just bring up Big Dom because, again, he was just the character. He was the best highlight for me in this week 13. But circling it back, the San Francisco 49ers played they just executed such a perfect game on both sides of the ball. This game meant so much to the 49ers. It was definitely something they had marked like first game that they marked on their calendar once it was released, because, and you had mentioned it, like they felt like they had the team to beat the Eagles last year, but Josh Johnson had to play that game because of the injuries that happened to Brock Purdy, and
then he got hurt.
So to see that revenge game for San Francisco and for them to have such a sweet taste, it's a little scary in that NFC where, yes, this is such a big game between Dallas and Philadelphia Sunday night, and I know you want to talk about that too, but no matter what happens in that game, the narrative still remains that San Francisco dominated both these teams.
Well, yeah, and when the NFL, you call them signature wins, and you talked about the Eagles, you know what, a win's a win, but they snuck out a win against both the Cowboys and the Bills. In both cases, Buffalo should have won that game, and Dallas could have won that game. A couple small plays, a couple calls that didn't go their way. And again, I'm not here and saying, oh, well, of course I'm a Cowboys fan, I'm going to say that things. I'm just telling you what I saw. And the refs had a couple calls that went towards Philadelphia. There were a couple bad plays. Since then, Dak Prescott's been playing at an MVP level. And I think that's going to continue this week. And obviously, yeah, I want to talk about this game for a moment because this is huge. Philadelphia, had they won against San Fran, there was a little bit more breathing room. This game would still be a big game. Obviously, Sunday night, whole country's tuned into this. Whole North, everyone's tuned into this. But now there's going to be something riding on it because the Cowboys could tie Philadelphia for the division lead. And if San Fran wins their game on Sunday, which I believe, I'm just going to double check, it's a good game for San Fran, I think. They're facing Seattle at home. So, yes, it's a big game. Seattle coming off a little bit of extra rest after they nearly beat Dallas on last Thursday night. But San Fran would not only be tied with Philadelphia, top of the NFC, but they'd have the tiebreaker. And ultimately, those three teams are playing for that one seed. And let's not forget the Detroit Lions came away with the win against New Orleans. So they're still in the hunt for that number one seed and the first round bye. But going back to this Dallas-Philadelphia game, I don't want to say that this is a tale of two teams going in opposite directions. Philadelphia is a good team. They found ways to win. But right now, Dallas is playing very well. They're now on what is a 13-game win streak, maybe even 14. I should know this. I'm going to just double check right now. I'm pretty sure it's 14 now. It is. 13 was last week, and then they beat Seattle. It's 14. And they come away with a game in which a lot of people are saying, look, they haven't beat really anyone good at all year. Who is this Dallas Cowboys? You just have to beat who's on your schedule. But the thing that was impressive to me is they were playing from behind for most of that game. They came down, marched all the way down, ended up with a field goal. 2 plays into Seattle's opening drive, a 70-yard slant and go for DK Metcalf, and they were just playing from behind the chains all game. And Dak Prescott and the Cowboys willed their offense. I'm loving what I'm seeing from Brandon Cooks. He's really stepped up and emerged, and I love watching the sights of the sound lines because that's, to me, where you see the Cowboys and interact. And every time Dak was like, we're not done. We're not settling. And even his press conference, it's like, people might say what they want to say, but he's feeling really blessed for where he is right now. Obviously, coming off a gruesome injury a couple years ago, he won the Walter Payton Man of the Year last year. And then, 2 tough, heartbreaking losses to San Fran. But, as I always say, adversity builds character. And this Cowboys team, a lot of people thought when Mike McCarthy was taking over the offensive play calling for Kellen Moore that was going to be an issue. Now, the Chargers are doing fine. They won a game in which they didn't score a touchdown, so don't know how much I want to give to Kellen Moore. But Mike McCarthy, in my opinion, has been better than I anticipated as a play caller. And I honestly remember Aaron Rodgers when he won his first MVP. It feels like vintage Rodgers, or obviously it's Dak Prescott, but it seems like that play calling and the way that they're motioning people, and everyone's making fun of the "here we go" and this is cadence. But if you heard Aaron Rodgers on the Pat McAfee show, it's how he's using his cadence and how he's going about it. He's using it as a dummy call. Here we go, and people are jumping. He's getting a free player. Here we go, and he's like holding off the go, and then it gets a few more seconds, and it's like Omaha. And we'd always just hear Omaha, and we're just thinking, well, don't defenses know that and stuff like that, but it's how you use your cadence. And to me, Dak Prescott's the MVP. Some people talk about Brock Purdy, but I digress. There's so much at stake for the Dallas Cowboys because they haven't had a signature win all year. You could say the Seattle one for sure is definitely a notch in their cap. But this is where they could come in Sunday night at home, bring that 14-game win streak to 15, and then say, hey, Philadelphia, you've got Seattle, who's going to be playing some desperate football as they try to get into the playoffs. And then you've got Giants sandwiched Arizona, two Giants games sandwiched in between an Arizona game, whereas Dallas has got Miami, Buffalo, and Detroit still remaining on their schedule. Dallas needs this win. It's not a must win. They're going to get a playoff spot. The loser of this game, might be facing the Atlanta Falcons with a losing record in Atlanta for the NFC South for the wildcard week. But this is a huge game for the Cowboys in so many respects.
Well, and you even just mentioned it too. Like this game kind of, it starts what is a very, telling season or summation to the season of the Cowboys in terms of who they're playing. They've got some very interesting matchups in Buffalo, in Miami, and Philadelphia that will really help shape this narrative of the Dallas Cowboys team, who, for better or worse, obviously they've definitely been dominant in their games, but facts remain, they've played a lot of teams with losing records and beaten a lot of teams with losing records. So now in this final stretch, you're really going to see what this Dallas Cowboys team is made of, I think, and can really propel them into a more optimal spot in the playoffs, right? And, I think with Dallas, I want to first preface by saying Dak Prescott is definitely playing his best football. The offense is clicking on all cylinders, and all of that is very exciting in terms of watching this Cowboys team play and just seeing, game in and game out, watching games with you, just seeing that they're never out of a game. But what this last Thursday night game showed me against the Seattle Seahawks is that they have to rely on their offense to win, because their defense may not win them these big games. And I know this is a defense that has one of the best defensive lines. They can bring the pressure, but they made Geno Smith look like a Hall of Famer on Thursday night. Like, Geno Smith was throwing to everywhere he wanted, making these big plays. And my worry for the Dallas Cowboys is when you're relying on your identity was your defense for so long and how they can win games and really step up to the plate. And now it seems like there's a shift where it's kind of coming down to Dak winning these games. And I don't know if Dak can do it against San Fran. Like, I'm just, I think that clash is inevitable if you're trying to get out of the NFC and trying to make a Super Bowl run, which the Dallas Cowboys are poised to do. And it's going to come down to Dak Prescott. And I want to be proven wrong, because I do think it'll be a great story for Dak Prescott, very redeeming. He'd probably get the absolute bank if he takes this team to a Super Bowl this year. Like, I'm assuming he'd be the highest paid quarterback next year. So there's a lot of really interesting storylines that could come out of that scenario. But I'm on to ask you, like, do you think that from what you saw Thursday, maybe that was just one bad game of your defense, or does it tell you that Dak Prescott has to be the one that wins these games for you?
Well, okay, so I'll start with the second point, which is I think that you want your quarterback, if you believe that you have a franchise star quarterback, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, you want the ball in their hands at the end of the game to win them a game. It's up to the defenses to keep the game close, not let teams blow them out, and, you're playing from behind. Again, Dak's been very good in protecting the ball, the turnovers. He came away from a play against Seattle where it looked like he was going to take a sack. It reminded me a lot of that Eli Manning Super Bowl play where, he just somehow got out of it. Obviously, it wasn't as crazy, and there was no David Tyree catch, but he came out of what looked like was a sure sack and got a key first down to Jalen Tolbert. And what I'll say to that is we have one, if not the best defensive players in the game in Micah Parsons. He is a game breaker and a game changer. Defenses have to game plan for him. DeMarcus Lawrence has gone away as an unsung hero. He came away with a big fourth down stop. What I was telling people, and I know some people had, and we talked about the Cowboys, are they going to cover that 8.5-point spread, which is one of the videos we posted on our Ruling on the Field TikTok account, which if you're not following, you definitely should. But we definitely, I definitely looked into this game as Seattle is playing a very desperate game. They are in a stretch where they lost at home to San Fran on Thanksgiving, had to go to Dallas, knowing that they have to go to San Fran and then play Philadelphia in a stretch which will ultimately control their schedule. and control the rest of their season. And look, the Seattle Seahawks last year, everyone was laughing when they got Geno Smith. They were a playoff team, and for the first half of that wild card game against San Fran, they were right in there until things started going away towards San Fran's way. But Seattle is a good team with great players. We've talked about this off the air many times. DK, Lockett. I know Kenneth Walker was hurt, but they threw in Zach Charbonnet, and then you've got Jackson Smith-Njigba, who's really stepped his game up over the last few weeks. They have a lot of good weapons, and Dallas still made plays when they had to. You're saying, oh, well, Geno Smith, he's not Brock Purdy. They don't have the offense. You're right. You're absolutely right. They're going to go up against a lot more tougher competitions. Detroit's going to throw a lot of things at them if they play them in the playoffs or when they play them in a couple weeks in the regular season. Buffalo, Miami. But let's see what's going to happen over the next few weeks. It almost feels like Dallas got to a point in the season where everyone's just saying, oh, well, they've got no big wins and their tough schedule's coming up. Well, let's see what happens. Obviously, as a Cowboys fan, I know it ultimately matters what happens in the playoffs. But they were in a game against San Fran in the playoffs where they was very close. They were in the red zone, and Tony Pollard goes down for the rest of the game. And it changed the game because he was our guy last year, and we threw out Zeke. And then on the very next play, Dak threw a pick. Dak hasn't been throwing that many picks this year. It seemed like last year, every game he was throwing one pick, fumbling it. He's protecting the ball a lot more. So not only that, when you put people in tough field positions and you're forcing them to go all the way down, it puts a lot less pressure on a defense. I'm okay giving up field goals. I mean, again, if Philly comes into Dallas and just throws up 40 points and Dallas loses 40-35, we can rehash this conversation saying, you know what? Now they've got to go up against Josh Allen. Now they got to go up against Tua and Tyreek. I'm pretty worried about this defense, but they've went up against a very desperate Seattle team, knowing that they had to win that game. And you could say whatever you want. I think Seattle threw everything they could, including the kitchen sink, and Dallas still came away with the win. And at the end of the game, they had 3 fourth-down stops in critical plays, to the point where Geno Smith's final play of the game was throwing in the dirt on 4th down because Micah Parsons was in his face. And that's what we can do this year, is we can defend and we could pressure the quarterback. And then ultimately, even without Trayvon Diggs, DeRon Bland, who every week you keep saying, let's keep betting on him to get an interception, continues to get interceptions. And you know what? I firmly believe that they can convert those interceptions into points. I like Brett Maher, but clearly the yips got him in the playoffs. This rookie, Brendan Aubrey, has been sensational. So now I feel pretty confident that if we throw out a kicker, we need those 3 points just to get some momentum, that we've got something cooking. And you know who else has something cooking, Seth? Jordan Love and the Packers.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Brandon Cooks. I was hooked on it.
I about Brandon Cooks. I said Cooks stepped up. I was segueing into a team that,
great segue.
To me, I didn't believe that the Packers were going to be in contention in this game against Kansas City. They came off a very impressive win against Detroit, but we talked about it recently about Detroit's defense really struggling. They nearly lost to New Orleans after being up by so many points. They've definitely got some flaws. But what do you say about the Packers who, and we were just talking about off the air, there was a Week 9 matchup where they beat Brett Rippon and the Rams, a game that no one cared about when it happened and a game no one's talking about since. But now when you look at the schedule, they're the playoff standings, they're ahead of the Rams because of that head-to-head win. Packers have 2 signature wins. Thanksgiving in Detroit. We talked about on this podcast. Oh, have you ever been excited for a Detroit Lions Thanksgiving game? The Packers went in and set the tone with a bomb to Christian Watson to start the game, and they came down the opening drive and they went up against. Say what you want about the Chiefs' offense struggling. This is a top 5 defense in the Chiefs, and they went down on the opening drive and scored points. And they've been doing that the last few weeks. Matt LaFleur is 16-0 in December games in the last 4 years. He is Mr. December right now. What do you make of Jordan Love and the Packers? Are you seeing a little bit of Aaron Rodgers? Are you seeing these guys and Romeo Doubs? And even though Aaron Jones is hurt the last few weeks and they still came away with these wins, and you're seeing all these guys who we don't even know about outside of Doubs and Watson making plays and moving the ball down the field. Are the Packers and Jordan Love for real, Seth?
Yeah, I think, there was 2 weeks ago, I believe, when I was watching watching Red Zone, and it was the Chargers-Packers game. The broadcaster, I don't want to name the person because I don't know who it was, but it was saying how Jordan Love was starting to really get comfortable in his position, and that it took him 10 weeks, but now he's starting to feel a rhythm and to understand what it is to be the QB1 and what that responsibility is. And, it's not something that you can just walk into. We've seen it even with all of our elite quarterbacks now, like Lamar, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Trevor Lawrence. They all had challenges to overcome in their first year as a quarterback. And now as we go into week 13, after, these 3 massive wins for Green Bay, a team that no one was even really looking at in terms of playoff discussions and conversations, now we're seeing them in a playoff spot, and we're literally having this conversation as they beat the Chiefs because Jordan Love is playing very good football. And you have to acknowledge that this, there was the stat, I think it was last week, where it was like his numbers in how many games he played was identical to Aaron Rodgers in his first however many games. And so I'm not trying to, I think regardless, we saw it with Aaron Rodgers and Brett Favre, we're always going to have that comparison of Jordan Love and Aaron Rodgers. It's that predecessor-successor relationship that he's going to have, throughout his whole career. But we're starting to see glimpses of Jordan Love into the reason why, or the rationale behind the Packers organization going all in on this guy. And that is definitely reassuring. And, maybe history repeats itself, right? Like we saw what Aaron Rodgers and Brett Favre, we saw that whole storyline. Maybe they feel they can get the same with Jordan Love. But what's even more impressive, and I think there's a lot to say about this Packers defense, I think they can bring a lot of pressure, but it's the young receiving core that I think for the next few years is going to continue to get better and elevate. And we're really seeing things start to click. For how many years were we talking about Aaron Rodgers not having the weapons that he needed to get to that next level? I'm not saying Green Bay's there now, but there's a lot of promise that, Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, can really, Jalen Reed,
Dontavian Wicks, Ben Sims.
There's a talent everywhere.
Malik Heath.
Yeah, Malik Heath out of nowhere last week was just making these big catches. So the point being that there is talent around Jordan Love. I think I mentioned it last week. I think Matt LaFleur is a very smart quarterback head coach. And having that young offensive minded head coach bodes well for these, young quarterbacks, as we're seeing. So I do think Green Bay is put themselves in a really good position, but do I think they can be a wild card playoff team at the end? I mean, there are 4 teams that are all at 6-6. And I think that's the perfect segue to lead to our final discussion of this episode, our little 2-minute round table in the NFC Wildcard. As I just mentioned, we have 4 teams all at 500. Sam and I are each going to say which 2 teams we think are going to make the playoffs and solidify this NFC wildcard, because it's pretty safe to assume whether it's Philadelphia or Dallas, that wildcard spot that first wildcard spot, the top wildcard spot, it's set in stone. So we're looking at the last 2, and I'm going to pass over for Sam to make his arguments, and then I'll tell you why I believe I'm right.
Well, I'll start with the Packers because we were just talking about them. And the first thing I'll say is everything that you said about the young receiver stepping up, Jordan Love playing his best football. Even when I heard him in the post game after the win against the Chiefs, he actually felt like this game was the most important game of his career, because he felt like when he came in to start for Aaron Rodgers last year against Kansas City, that everyone was looking at it being like, this guy just doesn't have it. And then a year later in Green Bay, they're able to show that they can not only play with the defending world champions, but they can beat them. And it's very tough to play in Lambeau. I mean, I don't know why Taylor Swift wanted to go Lambeau. Maybe she's now a football fan and it's the most historic place to play, but she definitely wasn't spending a night in Green Bay. But I digress. The Packers got Tommy DeVito and again, I have to use his name because, he's won some games. I got to put respect on it. They've got Tommy DeVito on the road against the Giants in New York. Then they've got the Buccaneers at home, at Carolina, who's the worst team in the league, at Minnesota, which again is going to be a huge one. Last time they played in Green Bay, Kirk Cousins won, and then home against the Bears. So not a very tough schedule. And I think right now the Packers have something going. You're talking about 3 big wins against the Chargers, against the Lions, and against the Chiefs. These aren't slouches. 2 of these teams are division winners and are going to be in the playoffs. Chargers were a playoff team a year ago, so there's nothing to hold their say like they weren't deserving of those games or deserving against teams like as you mentioned earlier, the Cowboys winning against the Jets and the Patriots and all those teams. But I digress. I think the Packers right now have something going. I think defensively they still have some great players: Quay Walker, Jair Alexander, Kyle Van Ness. I believe that guy's name. That's his name. He was their first round draft pick. And he had a great game. They were pressuring Mahomes. They were putting him off the line of scrimmage. There was a questionable defensive pass interference that should have been called. That wasn't called.
Luke Van Ness.
Luke Van Ness. Thank you. He's really stepped up. So I think the Packers get in based on their schedule. And then the other team that I'm going to go with, and again, the Cowboys beat them. They beat them handedly. So again, if you're saying they haven't had many big wins, the Los Angeles Rams. They are, to me, again, one of those teams where you just don't want to face them if they're playing well. Matt Stafford was fantastic last week. And we had talked about, the Browns defense, and they were definitely, going to get a sack on a Rams offensive line. That's not great. They kept Matt Stafford up all game. Kyron Williams, reminds me of Todd Gurley back in the day, like just getting into the end zone week after week, moving the chains. Puka Nacua made a huge play. Matt Stafford threw him a dime, made a huge play for a touchdown, got hurt a little bit, came back. The one guy who's been less than advertised this year is Cooper Kupp. I know he dealt with an injury to start with the season and has had injury moments throughout the season, but he's been like not the weak link, but he's been the guy that's been like the no-show on the team that once he gets going, they've got Stafford, they've got Williams, they've got Kupp, they got Nacua, and then you got Sean McVay calling it and dialing those plays. He's got that symbiotic relationship with Stafford. They won a Super Bowl together. You can't take that pedigree away. And at the end of the day, you're still going up against Aaron Donald. And, say what you want about him. It's not going to Defensive Player of the Year, but he's still one of the top 3 or 4 game breakers in the league. When you look at TJ Watt and Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons, I'd put Aaron Donald as the 4th guy that you just have to game plan around and make sure, because he can beat you and he can single-handedly beat you. And the Rams, when I looked at their schedule, they've got a very tough game against the Ravens on the road, which we've seen what they've done against Detroit, what they've done against Seattle. But then they've got the Commanders, the Saints, the Giants, and then the Niners in the last week. So I think they can go 3-2 down the stretch. And even if they sneak out a win against Baltimore, they can go 4-1. And maybe San Fran is resting those players because they've already locked in the number 1 seed in that final week, and they come away with the win. They nearly beat San Fran earlier in the year. And so I think the Rams and the Packers are those 2 teams that are going to get in. And I know, Seth, that you've got a difference of opinion on the 2 teams that are going to sneak in or get into the NFC Wildcard.
Yeah, you make strong points. I'm definitely going to give you that. And
Thank you. I'll take it.
But I am going to stick with my guns, my original statement that I made a few weeks ago about how I believe that moment the NFC playoff picture was going to remain what it was.
You just don't want to look bad. You just don't want to look bad and say, "Oh, I've said something."
No, I'm staying true. I'm staying true because I think
I back that.
I'm gonna bring my points up because I think Minnesota and Seattle, of these 4 teams, have the best players on their rosters. That's what I truly believe, and especially Minnesota, who's Justin Jefferson is on his way back. Who, let's not kid ourselves, this is the most dynamic wide receiver not named Tyreek Hill in the league. So that's a huge addition. We don't even know what he's going to look like with Josh Dobbs and how that's going to look. But, it's very easy. I'm going to start with my Minnesota case. And I do think they're going to end up winning that game against Green Bay. And I think that's going to be the big push for them in the playoffs. It's very easy to look at this last Monday game against the Bears and just think that was a bad looking Minnesota Vikings team where Josh Dobbs threw 4 picks and maybe, we saw the real Josh Dobbs in that game. And that's valid if you want to say that. I don't think that's the case. I think Josh Dobbs is a competitor. I don't think he's going to look like that in future games. But what's also something to be mindful of in that game is that they held the Bears offense in check with Justin Fields. And, I'm not trying to say that the Bears offense are, of this elite nature, but, a week before that, that offense looked great against Detroit. So, I think it was just a very interesting story to bring up because the Vikings have a pretty solid defense. They have one of the best pass rushers in the game. They have a pretty solid linebacker and secondary just in their team. And I think all of that combined with the fact that you're getting Justin Jefferson back, you have Jordan Addison, who's a proven threat. You have TJ Hawkinson, who's one of the best tight ends in the game right now. And I think all of that combined for me gives me the confidence to say that I think Josh Dobbs will be able to push this team into the playoff spot. They currently are in a playoff spot, and I think they will end up in a playoff spot. So that's my case for the Vikings. Now, the Seahawks are a bit of a more challenging story, and, the reason why I believe that they will be the team to make it, and they have a tough schedule. I do think they need to win 3 games in order for them to make the playoffs, and I do think that they can, because keep in mind, what we saw against that Dallas team was the best that offense has looked, and that wasn't with one of their best players in Kenneth Walker, who comes back this week, who is a difference maker in terms of what they can do with that offense. But we're now starting to see Jackson Smith-Njigba really come into his own, and that was the missing piece that I kept feeling for the Seattle offense, and I was just waiting for that shoe to drop, because now you have probably one of the best wide receiver trios in the league, with the way that Jackson Smith-Njigba has been progressing and elevating his game, which gives them so many more options, which makes them so much more of a threat. You actually saw some pretty explosive plays from Zach Charbonnet in this last game where he had to step in for the role for Kenneth Walker. So you might start being able to deploy a 2 running back system. And this defense has a lot of good players, but they're also the healthiest that they've been on that defense. So, yes, they gave up over 40 points to the Cowboys, and that doesn't really, that kind of is counter to my point here, but, I do think Devin Witherspoon is an absolute game breaker. Jamal Adams is back. They brought in Leonard Williams. They got Frank Clark, Bobby Wagner. There was a lot of names on that defense, a lot of veteran players on that defense that knows what it takes to try and make that push for the playoffs. So for those reasons, I'm going to stick with my guns, saying that Minnesota and Seattle are the 2 teams that come out and secure their spots in the wild card. But, time will tell. It could be it could be any number of these teams. It could be a very interesting combination that both you and I haven't even thought of. So, because look, Tampa Bay 5-7, Saints 5-7. Who knows how the rest of this season is gonna unfold? But it'll be a fun one to follow.
And that's why we watch the games. I think that you made some very, interesting points. It'll be nice to look back once the wild card rolls around and say, "Oh, do you remember when we talked about after week 13 about which teams were getting in?" And it ends up being Tampa Bay, or I think New Orleans I can write off. I think Tampa Bay and Atlanta will be the 2 teams for the NFC South, and I don't think the other team gets in, whichever one doesn't win the NFC South. So I think the 4 teams are the 4 teams. I'm going Jordan Love and Matthew Stafford. You're going Josh Dobbs and Geno Smith. And like you said, this is why we watch the games. There's still 4 or 5 weeks left. It's going to be very interesting football.
So after further review, that's the Ruling on the Field podcast with Sam and Seth. And you know what? Who knows what the script has in store for us next week, but we'll be happy to talk about it just like we have now.